Thank you for everybody being here tonight. This is so very exciting. Again, I'm Angela Maria Spring, the owner of Duende District, a pop-up boutique bookstore for and by people of color. And I am delighted to welcome you all for Penguin Random House's special Latinx Heritage Month event, Leernos un Reading Unites Us. I'd like to thank the Penguin Random House team, particularly Haley Larson, for all their hard work on both this panel, and we also had a youth event on September 30th. It's been really wonderful to be the bookstore collaborator on these events, but it's even more wonderful to welcome our featured authors tonight, who are all deeply talented writers doing vital work for everyone, but especially our Latinx communities. I just want to remind everybody you can purchase all their books at duendedistrict.com by clicking on our Shop Duende link. And just remember that when you buy with independent bookstores, you keep us alive, especially in these times where we're all just trying to stay alive in every kind of way. So thank you for listening to all that, and let's meet our panelists. I'm really excited about all of these people. They're just huge admirers. So let's start with Ingrid Rojas Contreras. Was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. Her essays and short stories have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Electric Literature, Guernica, and Huffington Post, among others. She has received fellowships and awards from the Missouri Review, Breadloaf Writers Conference, VONA, Headsbrook, the Camargo Foundation, DiGerasi Resident Artist Program, and the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures. She's the book columnist for KQED Arts, the Bay Area's NPR affiliate. Next, born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Daniel Padilla Peralta came to the United States with his family at the age of 4. He received his BA summa cum laude from Princeton University when he was chosen salutatorian of the class of 2006. He received his Master of Philosophy from the University of Oxford and his PhD in Classics from Stanford University. He is currently a Mellon Research Fellow at Columbia University. Next is Paola Ramos. She's a host and correspondent for Vice and Vice News, as well as a contributor for Telemundo News and MSNBC. Ramos was the deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and a political appointee during the Barack Obama administration. She also served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. She's a former fellow at Immersing Collective and received her master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School and her bachelor's from Barnard College, Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn. Next is Vincent Toro. His debut collection, Stereo Island Mosaic, was awarded the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award and the Sawtooth Poetry Prize. He is also a Poets House Emerging Poets Fellow and New York Foundation for the Arts and Fellow in Poetry, and winner of the Caribbean writer Cecil de Jong Poetry Prize and Repertorio Español Nuestras Voces Playwriting Award. Vincent is a professor at Bronx Community College and is a poet in schools for Dreamyard and the Dodge Poetry Foundation, is writing liaison for the Cooper Union Saturday program, and a contributing editor at Quality Literary Journal. And I have managed to lose Gabriella's bio, so pardon me real quick while I dig it up. My apologies, everyone. I know I am ridiculous. Just for some background information, I am the primary caretaker of a toddler. My life is just constantly like, ah. I'm just gonna hold on one second. I'm looking it up and I apologize for this. I will find it very fast. We have a very long email chain. Here it is. Thank you all for your patience with me. Here we go. The wonderful Gabriella Burnham is a dual citizen of the United States and Brazil. Now a New York resident, she lived in Sao Paulo as a child, and most of her family still lives there today. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the Writers Foundry at St. Joseph's College and has been awarded fellowships to MacDowell Colony and Yaddo. She has worked as a reporter, a creative writing teacher, and in immigration law, and It Is What It Is Stone is her first novel. So thank you all. I really appreciate you being patient with me through all of that. So I'm welcoming everybody up. Tonight we're talking about storytelling and how storytelling unites us. And I just want to get started. Let me pull up my own document. I'm having some technical difficulties, my apologies. Here we go. Okay, so I would like to kick us off by asking each author to share a bit about their own origin stories and how they first came to writing and what projects they're currently working on. And we can go ahead and start in our order. Ingrid, can you start us off?
Yeah, origin story. I didn't grow up reading a lot, but I do come from a family of storytellers. So I heard, I was just always in the circle with like my mom and my aunts and her friends and abuelas and everything, and just listening to stories. And my mother is a really good storyteller, and I think that's when I started to fall in love with it. It's just the way that she could just bewitch a room. It just wouldn't matter how many people would be there. She would just be, telling a story, and then everyone would immediately we would spend like the whole night just kind of listening to her. So I feel like that was my entry into loving writing and storytelling. I went to school initially for journalism, and very quickly found that I just wanted to make up stories instead of reporting on them. And so then I worked as a translator to make a living, and was studying creative writing on the side. So that's how I got into it. My debut novel came out in 2018, and I'm now working on a memoir that's about my grandfather, who was a curandero in Colombia.
I am so excited. You don't even know. Oh my God. Gabriella, you're the next person I see on my screen, so can you go ahead?
Sure. I have been writing for as long as I can remember being alive. I think that the first gift I ever asked for was a typewriter from my mother, and she found one at a yard sale and gave it to me. And I used to just write stories about cookies that come alive in the kitchen, ghost stories I used to tell my little sister, and she would be so afraid she couldn't go to sleep. It was always my way of kind of making sense of the world I was in, but also escaping the world in some ways too. So yeah, it's always been a part of my life. And I'm working on another novel now. I had a novel come out in July with One World, It Is What It Is Stone. And I'm not going to say anything about the novel I'm working on now because I don't want to jinx it, but yeah.
I love it. Intriguing. We can't wait. Until then, we'll just celebrate your first novel in all its glory.
First novel in the world.
Wonderful. Daniel, you're who I see next.
Yeah, so I also came to writing mainly through family. I had parents who were really invested in the idea that their children would write. And my dad wrote a great deal of poetry, some of which he would read out loud, but some of which he just kept to himself, just kept it in his private possessions. I began journaling when I was fairly young, and one of the more harrowing episodes of my early teenage years was when I lost my composition notebooks in which I had been scribbling away. There were these two tracks of writing that really appealed to me. So I was interested by the time I was in high school in writing poetry, in writing fiction, in writing in a variety of nonfiction formats. And I was also interested in analytic and academic writing of a specific kind. I'd become really obsessed with the study of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and I began to think of a life in the academy as something that would provide me with opportunities to work on writing in that vein. So ultimately what this led me to do was to try my hand at writing a memoir that attempted to synthesize these two strains, that a memoir that addressed the specific contingencies of my life growing up as an undocumented Dominican in New York City, with the range of intellectual and literary influences that had helped give me a grounding in certain forms of aesthetic experience. So the memoir came out in 2015. I have a book that's come out on Roman religion just this month, so y'all can buy that. And I'm now at work on a series of short and longer pieces that orbit the idea of citizenship and how citizenship is lived. So that's where I am.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Paola, you're next.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this. And I am a completely new author, so it is a great honor to be in conversation with all of you. I feel like I don't necessarily belong in the circle yet, so it truly is an honor. My origin story begins in a story that I think a lot of us relate to, which is un poquito ni de aquí ni de allá, no? Not really belonging anywhere. My dad is a Mexican journalist. My mother is a Cuban journalist, so I do come from a family of storytellers. I was born in Miami, but then grew up in Spain after my parents' love affair didn't really work. So I've been ping-ponging right between different cultures and different worlds, between the worlds of politics, which is how I started my career, the world of media. So it's been a constant ping-pong between saying that I'm Latina, but I'm also queer. And then until I figured out that I can be everything at once. And so I wrote my first book, Finding Latinx, which is out soon. In an idea that started almost exactly 4 years ago in the 2016 election, after working in Hillary's campaign for almost 2 years and being very much invested in the Latino community and thinking that we were going to win that election because the headline that I was dreaming was that Latinos were going to beat Donald Trump. And then you wake up the next day and that wasn't it, right? Less than 50% of Latino eligible voters actually showed up to the polls, actually cast their ballots. And so that made me sort of understand that I didn't really know what my work was about, and that I didn't really know what our community was really about, and that I had missed those hybrids and all of these different identities that were in front of us and that I hadn't seen. And so that's really where I took all of these different hats and I invested in this book. And the project that I'm currently working on, I'm talking to y'all from Arizona. I've been traveling across the country for the past months and very focused on election stories. So I'm just focused on continuing to do very small docs with Vice for the election. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. We're very close to each other. I'm in New Mexico.
That's right. I know. It's so hot.
It was so hot today. It's totally.
I'm only wearing this because I'm in a random hotel, as is my life, and it's very cold here. But it is literally 100 degrees. So
yeah, it's not quite as hot in Albuquerque, but it was pretty hot. Thank you, Vincent.
Yes, origin stories. I think I've told this one a lot. I think it started obviously as a reader. So I grew up, and I talk about this a lot when I visit classrooms. I grew up in an environment of bullying. In the community that I was in, there's a lot of working class violence, toxic masculinity that I was privy to in the community and also in my home. And I actually ended up, even though there were no books in my home and there were no readers in my family, I retreated to the local library because it was one place where I didn't get bullied. And so I just happened to pick up the books because that was like my safe space. And so that made me like a lifelong reader. Somewhere along the line, I just started to pick up the pen. I think really because like my first impetus to write was hip hop. I remember being like 13 years old and hearing Public Enemy and thinking, that's it. Like I found my vehicle. And I think when I was really young, I think, I wanted to be the first Boricua MC that people knew, but then, Lin-Manuel showed up or whatever. So, I think I started writing, but I kept it to myself because I was very introverted because of the bullying and the abuse. And I went to a wedding when I was 15, my aunt's wedding in Puerto Rico. And I happened to meet my mentor, who for some reason I mysteriously showed her my notebook. And she told me after she read my poems one night, she said to me, "Oh my God, you're a poet." And it was the first time that anyone had ever called me something that wasn't like negative, that wasn't like derogatory and negative. And so I was like, "Oh, I'm a poet. Okay, sure. Okay, I don't know what this poetry thing is, but it's not stupid or any of the other things that I'm called, so I'm gonna be a poet." I think that's where it got launched. Once someone named, I literally was named a poet, and that became like the cause for me.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Vincent. These are all just so beautiful. I feel like we have such a culturally rich storytelling is baked into so many of our cultures. And it's really wonderful to hear from all of you and all of your origin stories. And I use the term origin story because I feel like, you know, I'm also a writer, and I think it was like, we have to think about how we came to the writing. And my next question, you guys kind of, Vincent and Paola, you sort of talked about it. But I also like to think about like, where's storytelling the origin of our, you know, beyond just us personally, but like from our ancestors and from our lands, like, because it is such an important aspect of who we are, that oral tradition. You know, I wanted to sort of delve more into you guys, and any of you can answer, you know, the idea of, you know, our inherited storytelling, not, we talked about familial, but also like cultural and ancestral inherited storytelling, what that means for you and how it's influenced your craft and the lens you write through. Does anybody want to jump on that? Otherwise, I'll call names. I'm gonna make Ingrid talk. I know you thought about it.
You know, like with this, I feel like I was very influenced by both of my parents when it comes to the kinds of things that I'm interested in terms of storytelling. My dad was, when he was younger, he was a communist activist. And so he was like very political. That's his interest in politics was also something that just really fascinated me as a child. And my mother also had kind of like a curandera kind of psychic business in the attic of our house. And so I was just like very interested in both of these worlds. And I think that the kind of stories that I like to tell have a little bit of both. So I like stories that have that different kind of worldview understanding of reality that, you know, I think people would call magical realism, but I would say it's just kind of the culturally how we understand the world. And like the political reality, which I think in Colombia it's so inescapable to think of politics, and everything seems to always be folding back into violence and our cycles of violence. And I, you know, in terms for my memoir, I think there was a moment that really inspired me to write that as a memoir. So the story is, for some reason, even though I know this is not the same in other countries, or even in Colombia itself, but for some reason, the lineage of curanderos that my grandfather came from, only men could become curanderos, so like women were not allowed. And my grandfather just kind of like refused to initiate any of his sons for some reason, because he felt like they didn't have what it took. And my mother fell down an empty well, and she lost her memory for like 8 months. And then when she recovered her memory and she woke up again, she could hear ghosts, and she could see them as well. And so then it was kind of like decided that she kind of had arrived at being a curandera like on her own through this accident. And I had an accident in Chicago where I was just biking and kind of crashed into a car, and I lost my memory. And so my family in that moment was like super excited because they felt like I was now going to wake up and be able to like hear and see all the ghosts, and that it was like a repeat of the story. But you know, it didn't happen that way. And I think there was a point where I felt like maybe I wanted to write something like that, but in novel form. And I think the more that I told white US Americans about this story, the more that they said like, well, that's not reality, or like, that's how much of that story is real. and it just started to piss me off so much and I started to see kind of like the importance of claiming that space as like what is actually like a lot of our realities are like that. And even when I have read a little bit of the book, because I've been writing it I've been working on it for maybe like 2 years on and off. So I've read a little bit, and my favorite part is always like when I'm done reading and people come up and they tell me like a story about their family that also has that kind of like mixed view of reality, where like a lot of things are possible, and like ghosts are part of the story always, and there's always like some type of family curse that everyone has. So I think in terms of lineage, like I always kind of think of that, and I always also think of there's a lot of shame in my family about my grandfather being a curandero, and like things that we were not supposed to say out loud, or things that we're not supposed to claim. So it's both, yeah, so I think in terms of both kind of claiming and healing what that shame was, or like that, how that was imposing silence. And yeah, so I think I'm thinking of in terms of like reclaiming lineage and like reclaiming that kind of storytelling in that way with this memoir.
That's powerful. Yeah. Who else? Or I'll just start calling names.
I was just going to say, only because what Ingrid was just talking about is like, I think that in some ways that's the magic of writing fiction, that it can be a process of sharing stories that have been told to you, but also unlocking stories that actually live inside you that you don't know about yet. And, growing up, my mother's from Brazil, my father's white American, but he wasn't in our lives. And so my mother raised us by herself, and she shielded a lot of stories, I think, from us as a means of protection, but also I think protecting her own heart and, the immigrant experience, having to come over, and leave her family behind. So in writing this book, it was partly me reconnecting with my family and Brazil, and kind of making sense of my own Brazilian identity. And I had experiences of writing things and then talking to my mother about it afterwards, and realizing that actually what I'd written had happened. And so it became this sort of strange, and I'm not even someone who's that like mystical, or, but I found more and more that I was unlocking things that I inherited that I didn't even know about yet. So it's incredible how fiction has that ability.
The unearthing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like, can my poets speak to that? Because I feel like that's also a very strong thing. I'm seeing Vincent nod. So as a fellow Boricua, it's there. What do you guys think?
Sure. I mean, what I'm thinking is well, really for me, the meaning of storytelling is in the title of my book, Tertulia, which is the book that came out by Penguin in June. And the Tertulia it's a party, it's a celebration that happens in Spain and Latin America, but it's an artistic celebration. And when people gather, they dance, they tell stories, they sing, they perform. They also do political organizing in the back rooms. But I think about as a kid growing up, like visiting the island, and and even just like in New York, my New Yorican family getting together, and there was something important about storytelling in terms of the way community was built and the way people bonded. And I remember being fascinated by the performativity of it. So like other than hip hop, also stand-up comedy was big in my house. And the performativity of like telling a story, telling a joke, which had to do with content, but also in the way you deliver something in timing and pacing. So I got really interested in the musicality of it. And I just remember having like, these really intense feelings listening to like one of my tios tell a story, or to have like, my aunt or my dad crack on someone and, in a way telling a story about them when they were a kid or something. And so I think for me, that was something that I wanted to capture in this in the book that I wrote, is that the poems speak to each other in that same kind of way. They're dialogic, they're playful, they get intense and serious at other times, they're performative. And so for me, I think that there's the other aspect. Storytelling for me, I love the performance of it and the musicality. Like people just feeling their own voice, right? And getting into it and then embellishing, right? Because people are listening, and that power of captivating people because of that,
I love that. And the laughter, I feel like cross-culturally, we don't talk as much about, it's like, it's all our oppression, right? Just our endless oppression. But there's so much joy and so much laughter in our inherited stories and in our families. And, these are the kinds of, when I think about what I'm buying for Duende District and I'm reading these books, when I have, and it doesn't always have to be like, sunshine and roses, but if I get that, you know what it's like when you dig in and you get the entire thing, not just one layer that's just heavy. You just, you get the whole thing, and that is the joy and the laughter as well that we have and that we inherited and that we continue to have. Did anybody else want to jump in on this question? We can move on to the next one.
It's beautiful to hear this, because I feel like that's what I'm lacking as an author. I feel like with all these stories, I keep so much.
Did I freeze or did Paola freeze?
I think Paola froze. Se
I think-
congeló.
Uh-oh. Oh, she was just about to say something awesome. Like, no. All right, we'll have to. And she looks so impassioned too. She's like frozen in the best position, y'all.
No, I really want to know what she was going to say.
I know, I really want to know.
Zoom has robbed us of this.
Technology, why? All right, well, maybe we can get her to recapture it when she comes back on. Till then, we'll just move to completely other. All right. I know she's going to speak well to this question too. So kind of, I'm trying to make all of the questions as interconnected as I possibly can. But so I think this is something that I think we all think about a lot. But to be from a Latin American country or of Latinx background in the United States, it's so complex, especially in terms of whiteness and otherness. The Latinx identity has been harmfully consolidated into a series of anti-Black, racially biased, and in the US, of course, anti-immigrant stereotypes. So how do you write against the European and US colonizers' gaze, while at the same time celebrating our cultures and humanity? A related question is, how do you confront our internalized oppression and honor our Black and Indigenous ancestors as well? And Dana, let's start with you.
Yeah, I was just now thinking that Paola's sudden disappearance was a metonymic of a concern I had as you were getting ready to ask this question, which has to do with like the moral urgency, as I see it, of the writer's craft in committing itself to transmission and to a continuity of transmission and to valuing inheritance, and also the moral urgency of reckoning with forgetting and effacement and obliteration. And I think that that's particularly true when we think about the second part of the question that you just asked, the consolidation and the weaponization in some contexts of Latinx identity as anti-Black. And that has weighed on me and weighs undoubtedly on all of us as we try to think about the responsibilities that inhere in our craft as writers. From a Caribbean and from a Dominican diaspora context, one of the memories that has anchored my own understanding of what it means to be Afro-Latino is the unwillingness of some folks in my community in Harlem to recognize that I was the son of my mother because I was much darker than she was. And the interaction of racial matrices with like pigmentocratic ideals, with like colorist ideals, like this is all streaky through the inheritances that come down to us. So like one responsibility that we face is to do right by those inheritances, right? We have to name them, we have to talk about them. And the second one, as I see it, is to give life to the many aspects of Latinx identities that multiply beyond the strictures of the American racializing gaze, right? So like, to what degree is it our responsibility as authors to look to the construction of race in Latinx and Latin American diasporic contexts as a site for pushing against the hegemony of American constructions of race. So those are some answers that come immediately to mind as I think about that question.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Paola's back with us. We were all very excited to see. We were like, what's she gonna say?
No, I'm so sorry. That's just the reality of, I haven't been home in like 3 weeks. I don't even know. So I like depend on all these like random Wi-Fi. So I never know when this works. So I apologize.
No, we are, I think at this point, we are all intimately familiar with the technological downfalls of these platforms. But they're good too, because I think it's like, for me, I've been able to, our store's been able to hold these really wonderful spaces and events with all of my friends, my bookstore friends from across the country, and all of these amazing authors that I just would have never been able to afford to bring into DC or Albuquerque. And so that's good. And so we will put up with the technical difficulties because we're excited to have you here. I didn't know if you wanted, we were genuinely like very interested in what you were going to say. I don't know if you wanted to go back.
I'll be very quick because I know we've moved on from that. But just going back to that question, all I was saying is that I remember growing up and like watching my dad go to the studio and seeing him grow as a journalist, but also knowing that he always had dreams of going back to Mexico and running for office. So I just remember as a kid, I would always ask him, why don't you go back and run for office now? No, once he became a US citizen, I was like, why don't you run now? No. And he would always tell me, he's like, as a journalist and as someone that like has, pen and paper, I have more power than any president. No, I can use my words. No, and I think that has impacted a lot of like the lens through which I wrote this first book and through how I approach a lot of my storytelling with Vice and with NBC. And, I've been criticized for it also, but I think to me, I've learned that like politics is personal, no? And that is the lens through which I wrote this book, no? Particularly when it comes to the Latinx community, politics is personal, no? And through, I think that lens is everywhere. And I keep going back to, to that lesson that I learned growing up, where like, we have power to question authority, no? We have the power to bring up and uncover the dignity of people in a way that like no politician can. And so that is how I've been approaching a lot of these stories.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, that was like a lot of suspense for that.
It was really good. Like it was illuminating to me, I feel. Did you want to speak on the current question about writing against the colonizer's gaze, but also celebrating and embracing our cultures and humanity and fighting, against our internalized oppression, which I think is just a daily battle for all of us who are self-aware.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, that was a lot of the book, no, and that was a lot of the realization I had in 2016, like undoing everything I had learned, no, undoing everything that my light skin had taught me for years, undoing what I saw and how that was reflected in the Latinx community that I thought was out there, no, and so I think all it took was really like just looking around me. I come from a Cuban family. Then how is it the case that, knowing that in the island there's like more than 30% of Cubans in the island are Black, how is it the case that in my entire childhood I never grew up around an Afro-Cuban in Miami, right? Where they're all over Little Havana. My entire childhood I grew up with, the Mexican immigrant narrative. That was a dominant narrative in mainstream media. How is it the case that, we always forget indigenous migrants at the border, no? And so those are all the voices that I bring up in the book, because I went to look for everything that I was taught to not look at. And my own girlfriend, she's Black, but she's also she's Blaxican, no? But when I first started dating her, I only saw her as a Black woman, but she wanted to be seen as a Latina. How is it that I only saw her as a Black woman, no? So these are all of the different threads that I talk about in the book, because I think that's often what's missing in the political narrative, that particularly as we're talking about battleground states, I'm talking from Arizona, Biden and Kamala Harris were just here. The people that they're talking to are very different from the reality of what's happening in the border, no? So that's that to me is how I've been approaching it.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from Gabby. I'd love to hear from you about this. I know Brazil is, I mean, there's so much there, and especially in terms of this question. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, my main thought is that I think that when you decide to become a writer, you're also committing to becoming a lifelong student of history and philosophy. And, you know, the more that I learn, and I mean, this is really a lifelong process, the more I learn about Brazil and Brazilian history, the more I realize that if I'm going to bring up things like feijoada, samba, carnival, rice and beans, all of these things, I'm already talking about Blackness in a way, because those are all, you know, cultural signifiers that came over from Africa, because Brazil is a historic slave society, as is the United States. And so, you know, if you're going to write books that kind of accurately represent, and I mean this, like, if you write beach reads, or if you write children's books, or if you write historical fiction, or if you write nonfiction, I mean, all writers, I think, really have a duty and obligation to be grounded in the history of the land that they're writing about and the people that they're writing about. And so I think that that is one very important thing. And yeah, and also recognizing, as you mentioned Brazil, I mean, racial ideology is so tied to place. So the way that race works in Brazil is in some ways very similar to, but different from the United States. And it's been interesting kind of uncovering that too. But yeah, I would say that that's important. And then also in terms of like the colonizer's gaze, I think we have to, as writers, constantly question anything that essentializes people or stories, and become very attuned to cliches and stereotypes as readers, as observers of the world. And so that whenever that comes out of us in a first draft, or the first way we look at something, which will happen because we're all coded in these ways, our second glance should be to kind of question and dig into that further. And also question without worrying about whether or not there's going to be an answer, because answers sometimes are essentializing as well. So I think that that's kind of how I approach my own writing and the way I think about, you know, writing about the place that I come from too.
That's really, yeah, that's really good. I like that you're talking about the fact that there may not be right answers. I feel like, do you guys feel like we're in this place where we're trying to figure out how to be good allies and how to not be performative and how to respect, you know, our families and the places that we came from, and how to be able to, you know, recognize where we are in, you know, what space are we occupying, and are we occupying it over somebody else who should have that space instead of us, or if we need to make that space. And, you know, but it's all kind of, literally just had a whole text conversation with a friend who was grappling with this issue, especially in regard to Twitter, which I think is such a reactionary platform that it's really good at unearthing your inherent bias, your like unconscious biases, because you can like or retweet something really fast and then suddenly realize, oh, that was racist, you know, and like what's baked in. So do you guys find that like we're struggling with that, both just as people and also in our own writing? I will come on, people. Or am I alone in my struggle? Just trying to be better every day.
You're saying like the struggling with
just how to be, how, you know, the fact that we don't necessarily have right answers, and that people are going to stand in their pain, and you know what those spaces are, and how do we as writers be aware of that, but also as, you know, people who, these are our friends, these are our community, and how are we going to be, this country's a mess right now. Mm-hmm. How are we going to be better? How are we as storytellers going to be the ones who help weave it together as well as we can?
You know, there's something that I do just in terms of like your first question that I think is like a useful, could help with the second question. When I'm writing, I think that there's, as writers, we have to kind of contend with the fact that publishing industry is white. And so there's a sense, even unconsciously, when we sit down in front of our computers and we are composing, that we are composing for white people. Like there's a sense that because that's who the gatekeepers are, that we are somehow going to have to do some kind of code switching in order to be able to like sell the story. And I think that that's always there, just because we want to see our stories kind of come out. But there's a point where I just noticed that when I was composing, and I noticed it. I think my first novel is an immigration story, and I just lived in my day-to-day life so much the situation where somebody would ask me why I'm in the United States and when I came here, and even down to like what kind of visa you have, and like like I'm suddenly just being interrogated. And I just kind of noticed in my daily life that I would answer that question very differently if it was another immigrant like asking me, like, oh, when did you come here? Versus if it was like a white US American person saying like, where are you from? And like, where did you come from? And like, why are you here? That it's a very different story, right? So I started to notice that stories change depending on who we are addressing. So for me in my writing, I actually like imagine an audience with like rows of seats. And I kind of, privilege the audience that I want to be speaking to depending on the piece. So, for me, it was like Colombian immigrants, and then behind like other immigrants. And I, kind of like pushed the white people, like maybe like all the way out of the auditorium, like actually like maybe they weren't even in the room. And it was just kind of powerful to see how with that little kind of like mind trick of just imagining that I'm intentionally just imagining I am speaking to like these people that I want and just leaving everyone out. It was so easy to write the story then once I started to do that. And I avoided all the traps that writers usually fall into, which is like over explaining or becoming kind of like a tour guide of the story. And yeah, so I think that there's a way in which we can notice all the corners of power that we interact with in our daily lives. And if we are good kind of investigators of craft, then we know and we notice when they come up on the page. And then it's just about creative solutions, I think.
That visualization is so powerful, Ingrid. That's really wonderful.
It's like changed my life. I hope to try it out.
That's like the best craft advice. Did anybody else want to speak to it? I also wanted to we want to have some audience questions, and I don't want to eat up all the time. And so I'll ask just one more happy question before we get into it, but go ahead.
Actually kind of both piggyback on things that Ingrid and Gabriella said. So like beginning to what Ingrid just said, like I think that I'm not really sure why, probably because of the work that I do as a social justice educator, the communities I work in the Bronx. I actually write in opposition to it. Like I'm not writing, thinking about white readership at all. And in fact, in opposition to it. And I write in a way that if they are reading, I hope that they're going to be made a little bit uncomfortable, to be quite honest. I think in my work, even though I write poetry, like a lot of it's rooted in history, and very deliberately what I'm responding to is because what I experienced really was erasure. It was clear to me that Puerto Rican and Latinx histories were kept from me, both in my schooling and even in my own home, where or my family, where there was a lot of like white presenting Latinxes, Puerto Ricans who I think wanted to assimilate, and so my response was to reclaim those histories to understand them. So a big part of my work is preserving those things. So like I very deliberately write about, for example, indigenous leaders like Atahualpa and Huayna Capac and Agüebana, Anacaona in my work, and I celebrate Afro-Latinx artists like Basquiat, and writing about them is very deliberate so that I can bring back into dialogue on these things. And I also use not only Spanish in my work and Spanglish, really I lean towards Spanglish, but also try to reclaim Taino words and indigenous words in the work. And so that's one way I come at it, but I also think there's also looking inward and that internalized oppression. We have to do some of our own unpacking. And so I try to do that in my work as well. For example, in Tertulia, I have a poem about, in high school, my youth thinking that I was Latinx, and actually most of my boys, most of my friends were Black or Black identifying. I used the word, and I, you know, my friends clearly responded in a way that let me know that it was completely uncool. And so I wrote a poem about it. But the thing was, the revelation was not the fact that they rejected me so much for it, which they did, but actually the ways in which they forgave me. And so I used the poem to unpack that and why it was, you know, that helped me come to understand my own positioning, my own skin privileges. That just because I was Latinx, like, you know, like they were, that I didn't necessarily have right to those things in that language. And I think the other thing I do, but probably because I spend a lot of time in classrooms, and I think that this is really the most important thing when we talk about unpacking these things and confronting them, because I think you were talking a little bit about, like, you know, how do you become aware of, like, taking up too much space and where you can see that space. I just think listening is the most important thing, and I think it's completely underrated. Giving people actively, I think, is really powerful and important. And allowing the messiness of unpacking this stuff, forgiving yourself for making mistakes, forgiving other people for making mistakes, and just constantly being sensitive to the work. As long as you can see people are doing the work, let's have faith in that and just trust each other and allow us, because I think a lot of times, especially now, and I know why, we spent so many years being silenced, that people now get kind of aggressive about it. And I think that sometimes we just have to be a little sensitive and take a step back and listen.
That's when, yeah, grace. We have to have grace and humility. That's really wonderful. Thank you. Did anybody else want to talk to this? It's a really important one. I think it's really, it's definitely something that we at Duende District are constantly grappling with. So, but I don't want to take that space away from anybody who wants to talk about it. We good? Actually, I think if we're good, I'm going to actually get into a fun question from our audience. Who doesn't love to talk about this? So Lana Strickbine asks, are the types of stories you ended up writing your niche the same type of stories you originally thought you would write when you were really young or just getting started? Oh, and then she has a follow-up. And if not, when and how did it change along the way?
I wrote a lot of just really strange stories in the beginning where nothing happened. And I don't know what I was trying to do. I think maybe I was trying to write stories that were poetry or just was confused about genre or something was going on. But I thought it was great. I thought it was like amazing work. And yeah, so I think I wanted to do experiment. I think I wanted to be like an experimental writer, and tried very hard. I'm not at all. I am not at all an experimental writer. And then I think there's so much. I think like in my immigration experience, there was like so much suffering. That I wanted to avoid that story. And I think this was my inclination of being like, I am experimental, was to not go there and not tell that story. But I think eventually once I just embraced what I really wanted to write and just kind of avoided that, then so I guess, so I started somewhere else and then ended up kind of embracing what was really going to be kind of rich for me to tell.
Nice. Did anybody else want to jump in?
I was just going to say that, I mean, speaking about like writing from the white gaze or the colonial gaze. I mean, I spent many years writing stories that were like told from the perspective of a white guy who lives in Brooklyn, and I hated writing those stories, but I was like, this is what I'm supposed to write. And then it was when I started writing about Brazil and started reading like Clarice Lispector, I was like, oh shit, this is my voice. This is what and writing all of a sudden started feeling really delicious and wonderful. And I was like, I need to do this to survive. And because I was reading a lot of Clarice Lispector, it was also very experimental, very like, you know, just insular, and even early drafts of It Is What It Is Done were much more experimental. But then I kind of like got a vase around it and held it together a bit more. But I think when it first starts coming out of you, it really, you know, I think experimental is a good place for it to land.
Nice. My computer fell over. All right, let's go from Dodie-owned. This is for Donnell. How will I love this because I love that you have this history of Rome. How will your history of Rome differ from that written 25 years ago, presumably by a white author?
It's going to focus a lot more on the processes of erasure that Vincent and others talked about, right? So I'm really interested in what post-colonial and indigenous theorists have termed epistemicide. Like, I'm interested in how communities lose access to ways of knowing that are linked to environment, linked to practices that are situated and rooted in the soil or taken away from them. So that's how my history of Rome is going to differ.
Cannot wait. This is so awesome. These are like, because this is the history that needs to be written, right? This is I'm so sorry, everybody. We're probably going to end on this question just because we've got 5 minutes and I have a hard toddler deadline. But it's a really fun question. So, and it kind of ties into a question that I also had, and I'd love it if everybody could answer just from Karen Martin, what other writers have inspired you? And then my own add-on is, and what should we be reading right now? Who should we be reading? Let's start with Vincent.
You're putting me on the spot. All right. So I'm here 2 questions and I'll try to tackle them. So like the one, you know, the ancestors, right? The writers that came before me that you know, that I learned from. Juliet de Burgos, the Puerto Rican poet. Pedro Pietri is my hero, the New Rican poet. Vallejo, Victor Hernandez Cruz, Octavio Paz, Raul Zurita, Dato Laviera, a lot of the New Yorkers, that they were my biggest influence. But who I'm reading now and who I think you should be reading, I'll start with our pressmate, J. Michael Martinez, the Museum of the Americas. J. Michael Martinez is one of the most innovative Latinx writers doing his thing right now. Shout out to Afro-Latinx writers. Roberto Carlos Garcia has a new book coming out. Reina Leon is one of my favorite writers and just a wonderful human being. Sombra Dislocate, you got to read her stuff. Aracelis Germay. And you've got to all read, I think one of the most important poets right now doing their thing, Raquel Salas Rivera. His work is like not only way important for Puerto Rican people, but I think just he's doing such decolonial work in his poems. And I recommend, I think he has a new book coming out, but I recommend anything that Raquel writes, Raquel Salas Rivera.
Hard second. Paola, we haven't heard from you in a while. Who are you reading? Who should we be reading?
I'm reading right now Paola Mendoza's Sanctuary, but someone that really has impacted me and that I also spent some time with her in this book is Danieli Rodriguez del Orbe. She's Afro-Dominican, she's a poet, she's an incredible spoken word artist. And I had the pleasure, I started just reading her, and then before crazy COVID, I had the honor of like being in a room with her and seeing her, like her performance, and then watching the impact, right, of like being in LA, being in a room full of Mexicans, and then them understanding that like immigrants also looked like Danieli and how she was able to unarm a room with those words and with her poetry. So that was beautiful. So if anyone can check out Danieli's work, I think she's powerful, and I think she's a very important like millennial voice.
Thank you. Well, speaking of Afro-Dominican, Danielle, who are you reading? Who should we be reading?
Oh man, the list is so long. All right, so I was set on this path by a series of encounters with the writings of Julia Alvarez and Ralph Ellison in high school, and those two authors still mean the world to me. So keep reading them. Right now, there are two authors whose writings I would recommend. So Carla Cornejo Villavicencio's The Undocumented Americans, and Angie Cruz's Dominicana. And I would just ask all those folks who are joining us tonight, if you could just spare some minutes to do a little bit of reading in those two, they'll be the better for.
Absolutely. I think I have, like, hold on. Oh, Dominicana. Right here. You guys, these are great.
I also see that you have cantoras.
I have cantoras. This was from, so we had Angie and
I see.
Yeah, I have like Naima, Halsey, all Ordinary Girls, Chiquita. We had a really wonderful event a while ago. You guys, at Hervedi, like a lot of these books are on the Duende District shop already, so you can definitely buy them. Gabrielle, your turn.
Wow, okay. I'll have to admit I haven't been reading as much as I probably should over COVID, but I'll call out Kali Fajardo Anstein, who was going to be on this panel at one point, but she's a fellow One World writer, Chicana, and her short story collection, Sabrina and Karina, is amazing. But I'm reading a lot of like naturalist writing right now. Like I just read like Vesper Flights, and I'm in the woods right now. I'm just I'm reading about the sea and I'm reading about the woods. So
That's good because we got to preserve them. Like, oh, last but not least, Ingrid, tell us what you're reading, what we should be reading.
I'm super excited. I just got a galley for Patricia Engel's next book. Are you jealous? I'm so happy that I have this. It's coming out in February. But Patricia Engel is a novelist that I have just love all of her novels. Veins of the Ocean was one of my favorite novels recently written. And I also recently loved another US Colombian writer, Juliana Delgado Lopera. Fiebre Tropical. I love the way that they are going through. It's written in Spanglish, and it's the in-between language musicality of the whole thing is glorious and beautiful. And that book felt like I was home or like coming home. So I recommend that to everyone as well.
That's wonderful. Yes, I am jealous of your book. I can get it on eGalley, but I'm still jealous. These are all wonderful suggestions. Thank you all so much. It's just wonderful discussion, wonderful thoughts, and this has been a joy for me. I hope it's been a joy for you as well. And I hope to see you back in Duende District spaces, because this is what we do. And I want to thank Penguin Random House once again for just being amazing. And remember, you can buy all of these wonderful authors' books who you should be reading on our website. And if for some reason you're looking for a different book, just if you're on the Duende District platform and bookshop, you just search in the entire database, that sale will still go to us. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night. And yeah, much love to everyone. Be safe, and keep the hope up.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
So much.
Bye.